Hey all, here's a short treat for you. I was invited onto one of Malta's primary TV channels, Net TV, and Stephanie and the team there, we had a great discussion on the background to the WHO. So they've been covering very well the horrors of what the WHO are trying to do with the pandemic treaty, doing a great job there. But I suggested I might talk through where it all came from, Rockefeller, UN, etc. So we had a great chat. And just one quick thing before we get into it, I'm doing a few shows in the UK at the end of June, and one that is locked in now is Saturday, the 28th, I believe, of June, and I'm going to show it on the screen now and put the link down below, and it's back in the Attic Club in Southampton. Great venue, and we packed it out the last few shows I did over the last couple of years. So do join me there and maybe let your friends and any others know. And we're going to go through the whole global scenario now geopolitically and what's actually happening and where we've come from, where we're going. Then we're going to do a Q&A on that. And then I'm going to switch into mental health and resilience, the best psychology to boost your mental strength and create resilience within yourself to handle all of the challenges that we're facing in this fourth turning. So anyway, here I am, Malta TV.
Hi Ivor, welcome to our show.
Hi guys, great to be here.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, how about you take us into a brief history about the World Health Organization?
Yeah, it's kind of good, very important to know the history of where these things came from. And I know a lot of the conversation, and rightly so, is on the current debacles, especially since 2020. But in terms of history, I just jumped onto ResearchGate here, the first director of the WHO, Brock Chisholm, and a quote from him that was very sinister. And this is back, I think, in the 50s. To achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. So the driving force behind the WHO was supposedly health, but really it was just one wing of the Rockefeller empire to get globalism, full global management or government over the West and ultimately the East. So the whole thing is quite stunning when you know the full story. And I'll just mention Jacob Nordengerd and Rockefeller Controlling the Game. If you Google that, you'll find his astonishing book, and I got all my material from him. But basically, if we just look at the guy who set up the WHO and what he said, well, the Rockefellers in 1959 said that their challenge, working with governments and leaders, was to build a new structure which will make possible the fulfillment of the basic purposes of humanity. So remember, the Rockefellers were up to their neck in government, intelligence agencies. They were the richest family in America. And interestingly, John D. Rockefeller, the generally accepted sociopathic mogul of big oil in the early 1900s, he set up the League of Nations. And it didn't take because America wouldn't join. And then he was successful, and his five sons were successful in setting up the United Nations. And the Rockefellers funded the land and the buildings for the first United Nations building. And they're absolutely instrumental. And as Dr. Nordengerd says, they treated the United Nations as their own private club. So if people think the United Nations and the subsidiary, the WHO, or the IPCC on the climate thing, if they think that they're somehow grassroots from countries around the world, that's absolutely untrue. They all come from Rockefeller, intelligence services, the deep state, if you will. This is all contrived for world government and control of the people. And I'll just do one more quote before stopping for a moment, maybe. We cannot escape, and indeed should welcome, the task which history has imposed on us. This is the Rockefeller brothers in 59. This is the task of shaping a new world order in all its dimensions: spiritual, economic, political, and social. So the scope they had was multi-generational. They put enormous amounts of money, funding, and political influence into creating the UN and, of course, the WHO. And now we're beginning to feel the true impact of their vision, I would say. So maybe we'll have a brief chat on that and then get back to some more of the history.
Today in Europe we speak about democracy. Is this democracy?
Yeah. No, democracy was always a challenge for the oligarchs, if you will, or this huge group of oligarchs around the world, all deeply connected now into governments and corporations. So there was a quote years ago, I forget who, if the vote was in any way impactful, we wouldn't be allowed to have it. So we tend to get shepherded like cattle or sheep into this democratic system. But at the end of the day, as we see, especially in the last decade, no matter who you vote for, you get the same outcome. So in Ireland, it's right in our faces the last 5 years. Both main parties and the opposition all supported lockdowns, masks, and all of the madness. Totally. In fact, the opposition were actually shouting at the government to lock us down harder, even though we're the hardest lockdown country in Europe, right? In Ireland. So this is the problem we have. There's no alternative. And when other alternative parties spring up, either they get sidelined, attacked by the government controlled media, which happens all over the Western world, of course, or indeed in Romania and Germany recently, moves are made by the same guys up the top to actually outlaw the opposing parties who oppose this tyranny. You know, it's pretty tough. So I think one key thing for people is the only thing in my mind, and I've been saying this in my public shows across the UK and Ireland and on my channels, etc. I think the only thing that will beat this madness is grassroots pushback, the people rising with awareness. So our most important task is to get awareness out there so more and more people understand how the game is rigged. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's global management from oligarchies. So if more people understand it and push back with direct democracy and opposing it, on the streets, in discussions, all over the place, it will make their job extremely difficult. But as we saw with COVID, sadly, when people get caught uh, unguarded and they get massive propaganda in a deluge on their little heads, they don't know what to do. So we need awareness. I think that's the critical thing, and I think great job you guys are doing.
What can you tell me about censorship and this hunger for power to control the information?
Yeah, censorship is crucial. So it has been for all of human history. I mean, from literally back to Rome or Shaka Zulu Empire in Africa, it doesn't matter. So I always say it's a two-hander. You need propaganda, and as Goebbels said, I believe during the war, the Second World War, give me control of the media or the radio in those days, and I will turn any nation into a nation of pigs. So this is very well understood by all the organizations and oligarchies. You must have massive propaganda to just totally brainwash the population. One other clever thing they did for the last 50 years, very clever, was they instilled the idea of, quote, conspiracy theory. So they trained the world's population to believe that anything that indicated powerful forces way up above us were conspiring to control us like cattle, that is always a conspiracy theory. And it worked really well. But the propaganda is crucial, and we saw that in enormous waves since March 2020 especially. But the other thing you need, it's a two-hander. Propaganda, but you also need censorship. Because if you allow people to talk about the propaganda, chances are the wisdom of crowds will begin to grow and people will begin to talk and realize, hold on a minute, something doesn't smell right here. And then they'll talk about those things. And then it's a snowball effect. So you must have severe and effective censorship in order for the propaganda to flourish. So it's huge. Now, we see in the WHO treaty, of course, one of the key things they've put in it is basically information control systems. And they say it. We need information control and essentially censorship. We need only one voice on any health matters. Supposedly to protect us, but obviously it's to make sure people don't talk and begin to realize we are being scammed on a colossal scale. And interestingly, another key thing, I interviewed Philip Cruz last week in Switzerland, And I wanted to talk to him on the two key points he raised in his talk at the conference I attended. One was the information control, which is horrifying that they would write that into an international document. But the other one was a register of pathogens, including their genetic code, and inviting all the countries around the world to submit the pathogens they've either discovered or maybe they've helped encourage or gain of function improved. And then this big register would be accessible to everyone. That is insanity, clearly. It's the definition of insanity if you're a biochemical engineer like I am. It's absurd. And yet it's written into all these documents. It's astonishing, really, isn't it? The arrogance and the scope of what they want to do. And it's so obvious to anyone who's informed on this.
And obviously they use the health, which is a very sensitive issue, and that's what they did, scaremongering, right?
Absolutely. And if I just touch back to the story, back in, I don't know, the 50s and 60s, the Rockefeller Special Studies Project with Kissinger leading it, remember that guy? That laid out a prospect for America and the world. And I gave a couple of quotes about what they wanted, and they've come a long way. Council for Foreign Relations, they set up in 1970 with David Rockefeller as the chair, and that brought in all the world's leaders and top influencers and elite wealthy people. And the CFR has done incredible work, if we're honest. And then they began to identify global challenges. And interestingly, one was global health, because they knew you needed global health issues to fool people into supporting a world government. You needed crises, and then they could provide the solution. Sound familiar? But also, of course, their other key one was climate and environment. So climate fear was identified as a useful opportunity by the Rockefellers as far back as the 1950s. And they have funded hundreds of climate propaganda and fear groups. So yes, health fear and climate fear and financial collapse fear, these are the big opportunities they identified 70, 80 years ago. And that's essentially why we see all of those things in our propagandized media morning, noon and night.
How is the board elected of the World Health Organization?
Oh, it's non-democratic. I don't know the exact details, but essentially we know Bill Gates is the biggest funder because he also effectively owns Gavi, another huge funder. So between the two, Gates and Gavi, same thing. That's the biggest single flood of money. And the key thing is that the governments also fund, but the government's funding is not really relevant because the governments don't lobby, right, for tyrannical outcomes from the WHO. So essentially the big money and the real lobbying all comes from Gates and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. So when you say who elects, they can print out how they elect, but it's kind of irrelevant because you know the way big institutions work, they follow the green, they follow the money. So they'll essentially elect whoever the oligarchs indicate they would favor being elected. And interestingly, the European Union, I interviewed an amazing guy, God, his name escapes, Professor Richard Werner, incredible knowledge. And in the interview, it came up about the European Commission. And I said, look, it's basically like, it's completely non-democratic. And he said, but you know what the European Union and Commission are based on pretty much totally? And I said, what? He said, the Soviet Union, the failed Soviet Union. And Soviet historians have commented on this. So you have the European Commission, unelected, influenced by big money and deep state. That's the Commission. That's the equivalent of the old Politburo, the party in the Soviet Union. And then you have the European Parliament, right? But it's a talk shop. It has no power. And yes, the Soviets had a parliament for people to talk, but it had no power. So the WHO, the UN, and indeed the European Union are all totalitarian by their very nature, unelected and influenced by people who essentially want to manage the world, to keep us all safe. But really it's power and money. Power and money, same as always.
So who would you consider to be the employer of the WHO? In other words, the employer will have a certain amount of influence, I would imagine. So who would you consider to be the employer?
Okay, so I'm going to flick to the very end of the story for that one. So in 2019, an enormous thing happened. So the World Economic Forum, which is basically essentially a fascist organization because it's the combining of corporate and state to run things. And that was Mussolini's definition of fascism, the alliance of corporate and state. Well, the WEF, with all the corporates funding it, and all the bad guys, and again, WEF was set up by Rockefeller, right? Back in 71, the European Management Forum. So it all goes back to the same oligarchs. But the WEF made an alliance with the UN to apply and fund the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. Right? So the UN and the WF in 2019 quietly made a pact, and the WEF would use corporate and other monies from oligarchs to fund the UN. The WHO is a subsidiary of the UN. So essentially, who runs the WHO de facto? Well, it's WEF, the whole Rockefeller empire, CFR, Council of Foreign Relations I mentioned, the likes of their agents and global leaders like Bill Gates, who acts as an agent for them, and Gavi, etc. So it's kind of like a conglomerate of oligarchies, and that largely together tells the UN and the WEF which way to go, I would say.
Thank you very much, Ivor. Unfortunately, time is up for us as well. We have to go for a very, very short break, but shortly we're going to have James Roguski and Dr. Philip Kruse speaking about how important the 19th of July is.
Excellent. Thank you so much, guys. That'll do it, guys. Great crew over there in Malta. And again, final reminder, 28th of June coming, I'll be in Southampton at the Attic Club, and we're going to have a couple of hour show. I'm going to cover all of where we are and geopolitically and what's going on, the latest. And then I'm going to switch into a second session on mental strength and resilience. So I've spent thousands of hours going through all of the psychology science on mental strength and, of course, resilience. And in this fourth turning we're experiencing, I think everyone needs to get up to speed with the best tips, tricks, tools that you can use to really boost your mental strength and be able to handle whatever comes. So link down below. Love to see you there.